Наши поплыли туманы над рекой. Выходила на берег Катюша, на высокий берег, на крутой.
Выходила на берег Катюша, на высокий берег, на крутой.
Welcome to Boys Club. This episode is part 1 of 2 that we will be doing on ICE and U.S. immigration. In the second episode, we are going to be discussing recent events, including the recent murders of Keith Porter Jr., Renee Good, and Alex Preddy, and the many others who have lost their lives, suffered injury, and have been separated from family in what seems like Trump's attempt to deport more people than Obama was capable of doing during his 2 terms, and to be very open with the way they are doing it. But first, we wanted to discuss policing in the United States overall, starting at the very beginning with Crazy. And we'll be getting into that in just a couple of minutes. And then Ash is going to talk about the Mexican repatriation that took place in the 1920s and 30s, because it mirrors a lot of what is happening today. And then we will go over to Nico, who will take us through the history of immigration from the 1970s and all the way up to what I'm going to be talking about, the formation and history of ICE over the last 23 years. Just up front, I want to point out that there may be some content that we will be discussing that is pretty heavy, so please keep that in mind if you struggle with such content, especially since everyone's emotions have been taking some hard hits as of late. Lots of people are out there making comparisons to Nazi Germany, and though that is a good way to get some people to see how bad it is currently, there are groups, marginalized groups of people, who have always felt the fascism in the United States system from day one. And we felt it was important to point out the fascism of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy was actually based on the tendencies of our system. It was based on the enslavement and commodification of Black people and the genocide of the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Just because it wasn't recognized until 1915 doesn't mean it wasn't there in the system. We need to do much better as a society at shedding our American exceptionalism and start taking a closer look at the systems of capitalism, liberalism, and the white supremacy that all grew up together and are the rule of this land, and lead us into fascism whenever those systems, corporations, colonialism, and or imperialism are being questioned. With that, Crazy, why don't you tell us how this all began?
All right. So the history of policing pretty much begins in England. And the history in England goes a little bit further back than that as well. And so really policing as an idea started off as what we call kin policing. And kin policing sounds exactly how it does, where people were sort of expected to only to be responsible for the actions of their kin or their family members. And then over time, it grew into them being more privy to in policing the actions of their community. And they made watch groups. And so these watch groups were basically just people in a community solving problems. They would do everything from tracking down children. They would run soup kitchens. And some of the more, active members would, be catching criminals and things like that. However, overall, the system was very ineffective because it was basically just volunteer groups, and it was extremely decentralized. And also, it was just very, sporadic. People kind of just did it how they did. They just did it whenever they wanted to. Now, sometime later, it would evolve mostly in England again. There would be the system called the Frank Pledge system, where instead of it just being people in the community, there would be like dedicated groups of men in these systems that would, come together and kind of be like funded by their systems. And it is from this Frank Pledge system that we get, terms like sheriffs, because they would have, these groups. They were called tidings. And And then the tidings would get bigger. So the tidings would be like, 10 people, and then 10 tidings would be grouped into hundreds, and hundreds of these groups would be called shires. And then there would be these people over the shires called shirees, which we get the term sheriffs from. And the sheriffs were responsible for all of the, services that would happen in their shire. But this was happening mostly like in England. However, in the colonial United States, it was much more like loosey-goosey. So we had like sheriffs and constables. They would pretty much do their own thing. And they, frankly, didn't care about policing. Like, yeah, they had the kind of idea in place, but most people wouldn't even be policing. Like sheriffs, for example, would just go around collecting taxes. Because they would get paid more to collect taxes and be like the impromptu tax collector. And the actual like men that would be under the sheriffs would just be lazing about the community, just kind of like doing nothing really. They would be sleeping. They would be in the local saloon. They would be talking to people. They wouldn't really be policing. They would just be like this guys in the community, really. And so we get into kind of back to England again. And we come up to this guy named Sir Robert Peel. Sir Robert Peel actually presented the idea of making an established police force to the Parliament. It was literally called the Metropolitan Police Act. And he basically wanted to industrialize policing and make it something that was genuinely more serious and something that would actually be used in metropolitan areas as, more and more people kept coming to these areas to really resolve crime and things like that. So it is through the Metropolitan Police that we started getting, beat patrols. They will be, go around in a centralized manner, patrol their communities, and they will be publicly available both day and night. And it was this time where we started seeing the fruition of police ideology of like, criminals are less likely to commit crimes in a place that has like heavy police presences and things like that. And so, and one big thing for Sir Robert Peel was that it was very important for him for the police to be seen as a legitimate thing, as a legitimate force. And this is where we see the establishment of the actual structures of police being established. So, they will be under government control. They will have a military-like organizational structure. They will have a central headquarters that was located in easily accessible public areas. And he also thought that the quality of men that were chosen for the police would further the organization's legitimacy. Like, he believed that most police officers were to be like well-tempered, and they should be, good at conflict resolution and things like that. They weren't to be like these hotheads or whatever. And we got the idea of having uniforms, having badge numbers and things like that all came from Robert Peel, but he also thought that they shouldn't necessarily carry firearms or weapons unless they had adequate proper training. So that was happening all in England, and that comes over to the Americas, where, as you can guess, we dropped like half of that. Like, they did not care for half of that. There was actually a little bit of a tiny controversy where like the police officers didn't even want to wear uniforms, but they thought people would mock them. And they really, 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 really wanted to carry guns because they were like, well, how are we going to stop the criminals if we can't carry guns? Like, this has existed since literally policing came to America. And so, as policing came to America, this is where we see slave patrols pop up. And sometimes online, because as I was researching this, sometimes online you'll see people being like, well, see, technically, the slave patrols weren't exactly the foundation of police and everything like that. And it's like, it's just semantics, really, because people will say, oh, well, you see, policing is a form of law enforcement. And it's like, that's the only type of law enforcement we have is policing. Or they'll say, oh, policing is more like slave patrols were transitional to what we have in the modern day. And it's like, that's just another way of getting around the fact that the origins of police are slave patrols. In fact, we have some researchers who go by the name David Barlow and Melissa Barlow noted that by 1837, the Charleston Police Department had 100 officers, and the primary function of this organization was slave patrol. These officers regulated the movements of slaves and free blacks, checking documents, enforcing slave codes, guarding against slave riots, and catching runaway slaves. And as we understand, the slave patrol was to, of course, catch runaway slaves. And then when slavery was abolished, this is the thing that makes me mad, because on Wikipedia say, oh, the slave patrols were abolished when slavery was abolished. No, they weren't. Because they were still regulating the movements of Black people and African Americans when they just didn't have slaves to beat up on anymore. They just went to Black people. And many of the early slave patrols were literally Ku Klux Klan members. Like, there is a direct link between Ku Klux Klan slave patrols and then the establishing of these police departments from the foundations of these slave patrols. Again, like, there was never a slave patrol that was just officially called, Displaces Police Department, but the influence of them were definitely, the influences are parallel to how policing were, how people were treated, the tracking down people, the idea that we have the right to move across the country and literally track people down for their crimes. Again, the whole checking the documents thing. Like, this is where these ideas came from, and it came from the policing of Black bodies in America. And we see now that those very same things were taken back overseas, back to Europe, and the Nazis were doing this very thing to Jewish citizens and other minority groups, checking their documents, going door to door, tracking them down, beating them in the streets, all of this. And then we also see it coming back home to roost with immigration. We see them, again, tracking people down, going door to door, checking their documents, trying to see where they're going. Who are you? What are you doing? Where do you come from? And all of this. And it comes from slave patrols. And so, as policing ends up advancing out of slave patrols and evolving more and more, we get to the 1800s, 1970s, right? And policing ends up becoming more modern. We start getting actual established police departments in around the 1840s is where we get actual police departments. So, for example, we have the New York City Police Department was unified in 1845. St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department was in 1846. The Chicago Police Department was in 1854. And the Los Angeles Police Department was established in 1869. And a lot of these agencies would take on three distinct different characteristics from their English counterparts. One being a limited police authority. The powers of the police were defined by the law. Two was local control. Local governments would bear the responsibility for providing police service. And three, fragmented law enforcement authority, meaning that several agencies within a defined area share the responsibility for providing police services, which ultimately leads to problems in communication, cooperation, and control amongst these agencies. Is something that, again, we still deal with to this day in the United States. And so, moving more into the 19th century, policing was it was already political. But now it really, really, really was political, because the police were essentially just goons that were working on behalf of politicians. So when a politician would enter into office, they would essentially just be able to freely elect and select who they wanted on the police force. And these police officers were essentially tasked with helping whatever politician just gave them their job stay in office. They had no interest in helping the public. They had no interest in doing it. If they did, they were doing it only to make the politician who they literally were in the pocket of happy. They didn't do it because they actually cared about community policing. And this just goes to show, from a more Marxist perspective, how directly police work for the state. Policing has never been for the community at hand, because when it was, beating down slaves. And also, fun fact, slave patrols actually did end up accosting white indentured servants at a certain point as well. And so if it was anything towards the community, it was policing them and, making them feel less than. And if it wasn't necessarily towards the community, it was for politicians, for the state, protecting their property, protecting their position, protecting their political office. And every time like a politician would like come out of office, they would change the police chiefs. Here we have a report that Cincinnati went through 7 chiefs between 1878 and 1886. Buffalo tried 8 between 1879 and 1894, and Chicago saw 9 come and go between 1879 and 1897, and Los Angeles changed heads 13 times between 1879 and 1889. And this is also where we start finally getting our first reports of how much like these police officers were being paid. And it's so funny looking at the numbers. They're like, they were paying $400, and $1,000 is back then was like tens of thousands of dollars, or even today, even being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like these people were essentially just like being bribed straight up just into their positions. The rate going from a sergeant's position back in this time was $1,600, and it went to $12,000 or $15,000 for the position of a captain, which is basically like saying you were getting paid like, I didn't do the numbers, but it's like basically going from getting paid tens of thousands of dollars to getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in like today's money. That is a ginormous increase just for changing like one position. That is unconceivable for anyone else that is part of the working class. Essentially, any actual working class person could never dream of getting a raise like that. And the only people that were working class that were getting raises like this were police, because they were agents of the state. And on top of that, because of this, influence of politicians, the police officers, again, as you could probably guess, were not doing their job. They were completely incompetent. Under the old system, police officials were appointed through political affiliations because this was why they were frequently unintelligent and untrained. They were just distributed through the area to be policed according to a hit-or-miss system and without adequate means of communication. They had little or no record-keeping system, and their investigation methods were obsolete, and they had no conception of the preventative possibilities of the service. New policemen heard a brief speech from a high-ranking officer, received a hockey club, a whistle, and a key to the call box, and were sent out on the street to work with an experienced officer. Not only were the policemen untrained in law, but they operated within a criminal justice system that genuinely placed little emphasis upon legal procedure. So around this time, this is where a lot of the history around policing starts focusing a lot on like technology and technological advancement. Because in the mid to late 1800s, call boxes were a thing. So, if you see maybe like old movies and stuff, you would have like this big blue call box that would sit on like a light pole. That was more for police to be able to be like, hey, if you're out here, please go to so-and-so place. There's a crime being committed. Police actually have to, start doing their job and taking it seriously. To start implementing all of these things, all these different technologies like call boxes, radio receivers, patrol cars got better, had better communication, better radios, and things like that. And this would help with, policing actually doing their job, catching criminals, but it also made it very, again, easier to keep policing underprivileged communities, because then they can just be like, hey, I need backup. I need officers to this area. There's too many delinquents over here. I'm going to need extra hands. I'm going to need extra guns. And so is not, coincidental that during this time, police brutality and police violence started increasing more and more as these were more effectively able to police areas and, monitor the movements of Black people. And so this is how we lead into more like the civil rights era. And so you have, police brutality, you have everything from like the LA riots to the civil rights movement, you have Black Panthers. They're doing everything they did with police, trying to, bring in a system like community policing. And the police obviously didn't really like that. And this would just lead further and further and further and further and further to what we see today, where we have, you see a lot of articles called this the reform era, where we see the social effects of policing and then we try to reform it. But the problem with this, that I hope is very obvious to a lot of you, is that you can't reform something that was already there from day one. The problem with police we see has literally been present since police have been a thing in America. Police, as a societal issue, has literally been a problem since their inception. Police have always been a problem, and their problem has always been anywhere at best from them just not doing their job, which we think is protecting the public, stopping crime, to at worst, they are just straight up like, abusing citizens, killing people, beating people on the side of the street. And fundamentally, you cannot, talk about the system of policing without talking about the state and the workers' role in the state. The police protect property. They protect what the state, sees as theirs. And what they see as theirs is your labor. And so if you're not, laboring, if you're not, selling your labor to get, a wage, that's basically the basis of everything we understand to be a crime. So you can't reform, you can't get better training, because better training is going to lead to police being able to better hurt people. You can't even get them better technology, because we see the militarization of police as well. Yeah. Because they're just going to use that to monitor you better. That's how we are living in the police surveillance state now. It has always been about surveillance. It's always been about tracking people it's always been about telling other people, usually on the basis of race, no, you cannot do that. And no, you cannot do that because you are Black, because you are Latino, because you are Asian, and all this. And we see, I know other people won't get into it, but we also see this is how stuff like Border Patrol ends up happening. The next point, I know that Ash is going to be tackling it next, but this is how we get the basis of even stuff like Border Patrol, because Border Patrol also operates off of monitoring and tracking people's movements. And modern day Border Patrol comes from, Texas Rangers. Texas Rangers comes from the Mexican-American War. Mexican-American War is a colonialist war that American settlers, waged against, Mexican citizens as we were doing Manifest Destiny. And so you have, these essentially colonialists, literal colonialists, fighting off Mexican citizens off rightfully their land, colonizing it, settling it. And then these same people then go and make border patrols so they can keep all of the illegal aliens from coming into the country when, originally these people were already here. And it started off mainly from the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then it went into then Border Patrol kind of takes a bit of a pivot, and then they go into war, because they were used during World War II quite a lot, and then that's how they come back to America. Again, they always go somewhere else and then come back. It's where we start getting stuff like repatriation and Mexican repatriation, stronger border, principles. So you have Operation Hold the Line, you have Operation Gatekeeper, and they just keep increasing more and more and more. But I think Ash or Nico is able to talk about that more in depth.
Yeah, we'll bring it over to them. I wanted to mention that $15,000 in 1910 is $511,000 plus today. So those sheriffs are making decent money. Does anyone want to add to anything that Crazy went over? No? Okay. All right. So let's move on to Ash. Though America early on was propagandized as the land of the free and that it was some great melting pot, there were a lot of early acts, laws, and actions during certain historical periods that pertain to immigration in this country, showing the dream was not really there for just anyone. One of those periods in our history was the Mexican repatriation, which started in the 1920s. Why don't you take us through what happened with that, Ash?
Yeah. Also, I want to say, Crazy, that's like an amazing overview of policing. I just want to say, like, that was amazing. I'm actually going to back up with Mexican repatriation. I'm actually going to start in the 1910s, mostly because it'll be missing context without it. And when I was doing research on this, I wasn't actually seeing this connected very often, which was pretty disappointing. So in the 1910s, the border was basically just open. People would come, they would work, people would go through every day. You didn't need papers, nothing like that. So I'm mostly going to be talking about El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez. So basically what was happening is like primarily was women in the 1910s who would come through the border every day, and they would come and they would work. Many of them were like maids, things like that. And what happened is they had started searching them, like searching their bodies, because the mayor of El Paso, Texas, he's part of like the eugenics movement that was happening at the time, along with like the Surgeon General of the United States. They were worried about typhus outbreaks. And so what they had begun doing is, for one, they were propagandizing Mexicans with like rhetoric of like Mexicans have a lot of babies, they are unclean, they carry lice, things like that. And what they had begun to do, I actually have a direct quote. What they had begun to do, which was led by the mayor of El Paso, is they were, quote unquote, disinfecting Mexicans at the border, and they were stripping them. This is the trigger warning: stripping them completely naked, checking their genitals, checking everything. The women had to do this every 8 days. They were bathing them in kerosene. And they also were using Zyklon B to disinfect their clothing. This is also oftentimes used on them directly. This is where Hitler and the Nazis directly get this idea to use Zyklon B. It gets referenced in a journal by a Nazi scientist in the 30s, where he is proposing they use it, and they actually show photos of these delousing warehouses where they were forcing people to go into. So in 1917, a young lady, she's 17, her name is Carmelita Torres. She is riding the trolley. She comes to do her work. And she one day convinces the women on this trolley to fight back, that they're not going to submit to this. They're not doing it. She's very successful. And this ends up starting the bath riots. It lasts 2 days. It starts with just 200 women. This is mostly women, by the way. Grows up to 2,000. They're able to shut down the border for 2 days, which greatly affects the economy. They end up arresting Carmelita. Nobody knows what happened to her after that, and they execute some of the men who participated in this. And this is not where the story ends. So then we see directly after this, we see major sweeps all across the Southwest. It doesn't matter if you have papers. It doesn't matter if you're born here. It doesn't matter anything. They are basing it off of, what they think Mexicans stereotypically look like. This obviously isn't only affecting Mexicans, by the way. They are, as you know, like racists will call anybody who's Latino Mexican. Like they think that we're all just like one, like country of origin and like ethnicity and whatever. They also are doing it based off of accent. And then so in 1929, there was a stock market crash. People have already been propagandized to like scapegoat Mexicans and like have all these stereotypes about them already. And they start telling people like the reason that you don't have a job is because of Mexicans. They are not real Americans. And they start saying like, we want jobs for real Americans. And they start saying that like Mexican women have too many children and that like they are using up all of the relief programs. And they start telling people that, hey, if we send Mexicans back to Mexico, it's going to save $14 per person. That ends up not being true. Obviously, it was only $1.50. And also Mexicans were less than 10% of the total people who were even like on this relief aid. And then ironically, they end up paying the Pacific Railroad Company $14 a person to send them from all different parts of the country. This is mostly the Southwest, the West, but this happens all over the country. $14 a person to put them all the way into central Mexico. So they end up deporting over 2 million people. 60% of them are citizens. They were born here. Maybe they've been here for several decades. Many of them have never been to Mexico. And they're like in this new place that they've never been. And then once they get there, the US government tells them like, once you're out of the country, like it's not our problem. So they're like refusing to help them get back in. Many of them don't have access to documents. They didn't allow them to take documents. Families are separated. Many children went home. Their parents were not there. There are a lot of stories of how people never saw their family ever again. And it's just so brutal and like more than people realize. Like at the same time as this is happening, they're also going like door to door in Mexican communities in El Paso, Texas, to do like lice checks. And if you are found to have lice in your home or on your person, whatever, they are putting you into kerosene baths and they're burning down your house. Like many people didn't survive this. One of the prisons that they did this in, this was primarily Mexican men, and they were forcing them into kerosene baths, and somebody lit a match, and 27 of them died. Like, this is so much more than just like forcing people out of the country. And even that alone is awful. So I'll end it there.
Yeah. That just nasty stuff. One of the things I just wanted to say quickly with what you were talking about, and I'll be talking about it a little bit later, is what they were doing at the border earlier in the 1900s. They actually made policy of in 1944 with Title 42 expulsion. So we'll get into that. Crazy, Nico, do you want to add anything right now? Okay. The one other thing I wanted to bring up was I know that Nico wanted to kind of get into it, is the Bracero program. It's something I heard of, years ago. I heard of it, but I didn't realize, exactly how they treated the people in it until last year when I was working on my Parenti stuff. I came across and I was reading how up in Maine with this Bracero program. So that was it started in 1942, and during that time, and it went through the mid 60s. And Nico will get into the later ends of it, but like this particular time was they needed the help. They needed the workers up here because our workers were at war, and so they asked Mexico if can we hire people up here? And through the program, like 4.6 million contracts were done. So how many people that was, they could have had more than one contract. But in the particular one I'm thinking of is up in Maine, they were doing logging, which is, it's a dangerous job too. And they're up there doing logging alongside the Nazi prisoners of war up in Maine. And who in 1945 gets kicked out of the country and who gets to stay here and live here, So that was I just wanted to bring that up. So between the years of 1970 to 2000, the United States saw a surge of immigrants going from 9.6 million or 4.7% of our population in 1970 to 28.4 million or 10.4% of the entire population in 2000. And because of this, each administration created their own laws, acts, and or actions to counter the flow of people migrating to America, even though one main reason they were and still come here is due to sanctions, tariffs, and anti-communist actions the United States took throughout the world, but in particular within Latin America and the Pacific. Nico is going to take us through more specifics of what was happening in that time period. So go ahead, Nico.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate you bringing up, both you and Ash bringing up the Bracero program, because I'm going to also backtrack a little. Because of the 70s, it was the setup of this like distinct change in like immigration policy. And there were two major things that happened, and they both happened in 1965. And that was the ending of the Bracero program, which of course affected the ability for Mexican citizens to be able to come here and to the US and work. It was a very exploitative, inhumane program, but it did ultimately financially affect a lot of families in Mexico. And it also created labor shortages here in America that we started to really feel in the 70s, because it took a few years for that like effect to really hit us. The other thing is in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. Basically, what that was is it abolished the like national origin quota system that we had from the 1920s, which had always favored Northern Europeans specifically. It implemented kind of a policy that focused on family reunification, skills, and refugees. That was a kind of shifted the demographic of immigration from Europe to Asia and Latin America. Even though it was intended to kind of balance out it, they were trying in a way to balance out like the overly European immigration like people coming in, or immigrants coming in. But the Democratic chairman of the House for the Immigration Subcommittee, with the work of some conservative House members as well, they prioritized immigrants with family members already in the United States. And it was done intentionally because they wanted to make it seem like the family structure was European. It was Anglo-Saxon. So when people were coming in by themselves, it already gave off a negative aspect versus the idea of like, well, my family's coming here from Europe because they've already been here. Of course, that's how it was for, Latin American immigrants as well. They'd always been here, Central America, specifically in Mexico. But of course, colonizers are going to be colonizers, settlers are going to be settlers. But both those programs lead us into the 1970s. One of the main things that happens during the 1970s is the U.S. administration starts to feel a lot of pressure from the lack of labor and the all of a sudden rise of immigrants coming from over the border, because all of a sudden these people who've been working here for decades don't have work anymore, or legal work in that sense. And what the United States government did is they went to media, because around the 1970s, we really start to get that expansion of news and all that stuff that we begin to like see as like an everyday part of our life. And they intentionally started talking to reporters and newscasters. They start to emphasize the threat of immigrants that they pose to like the stability of our economy. The media obliged. They started to do xenophobic coverage that basically scapegoated specifically Mexicans for the country's economic woes during the 70s. But because of this wave, which is formally more known as the fourth wave of like immigration here to the US, we get to see, like you went over those numbers, I won't go over them again. We see the continuous rise of immigration like numbers in America. Basically, during that time, I'm trying to think what else happened in the 70s. During that time, Gerald Ford in 1975 creates a committee called the Committee of Illegal Aliens. That's the title of it. It's not great. I don't like it. I'm sorry, I have to say it. They were a committee. Why am I saying committee? They were a committee which reported that unauthorized immigrants were depressing wages for low-skilled workers and recommended employer sanctions and increasing enforcement. I actually pulled up an official document from one of these committee hearings, and it goes into, and I'm not going to read from it, but it goes into this idea that they say straight up, we actually don't have any data to back up that illegal immigrants are, taking resources from us. We have nothing to show that they are being smugglers or anything like that. But we're going to assume that's what they're doing. And because of that, we're going to tell the president of the United States that they need to be stricter. We need to figure out how to make sure they can't come back over. So this committee kind of starts to set the groundwork for what we start to know as detention centers. They start prepping. They are ready. They need to find out a way to make sure that if you're not going to, they can't make you go back to where you came from in a real sense, they're going to imprison you. And so that really starts to kick off in the 80s. And the one thing that really sets it off is basically what is known as the Mariel boat lift, which, if we're familiar with, that is when a bunch of, when migrants from Cuba, because of, because communism's bad, starts to come to America through boats. And President Ronald Reagan around that time, and I believe Jimmy Carter, they both try to figure out like good solutions. A lot of people get really upset because of Jimmy Carter's kind of wishy-washy opinion or legislation on that stuff. He kind of like sometimes is letting people come in, sometimes he's making people go back. But Ronald Reagan is the person who really begins to formulate a detention center. The first one actually would be Fort Allen in Puerto Rico. It was used to detain It was used to detain Haitians and Cubans. It was started during the Carter administration. Also during this time, it's really important to mention that Reagan launched the war on drugs. It would pave the way for the increased militarization of the border, and start the conflation of drugs and immigration, like tying them together, which is something we are still seeing today with our current legislation. In 1983, Reagan forms the Mass Immigration Emergency Plan. That is when the Mass Immigration Emergency Plan starts to require 10,000 immigration detention beds be located and ready for use at any given time. During 83, we also see the first private prison company, which is called the Corrections Corporation of America, enter its first governmental contract for an immigration detention center. It would be located in Texas, and immigrants were first detained at a hotel that was owned by Corrections Corporation of America until the detention center was built. In 85, CCA would open their second facility in another location, another city in Texas. And it would be the first detention center in the US to detain infants and children. It continues on. It's kind of interesting to see how within this period that, we see the real foundation of detention centers and seeing how horrible and horrifying they've always been, but how they've, how rapidly it grew. Because even a year later, we get the Immigration Reform and Control Act that we know as basically I-9 forms. What we have to use to show that we are authorized workers and gives legal standing to prosecute companies that hire people who are not here legally by the US's standards. During this time, we start to get more and more corporations that are also starting detention centers, privately owned detention centers. GEO in 87 opens the Aurora Detention Center in Colorado. And then finally, in the year of 88, we get the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. It required a mandatory detention of all non-citizens who had committed an aggravated felony, beginning a new era of mandatory immigration detention. And it was with that, after, Reagan finishes his term, we move into the 90s. We get, in 91, we get the Migrant Operations Center that is located in Guantanamo Bay. Before, this naval base was used to hold prisoners of war, which is what most of us, at least people outside of the communist sphere, it was used for the war on terror. It was used to hold asylum seekers and refugees. From 91 to 95, because of the U.S. overthrowing a democratically elected John Bertrand Aristide, I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, I'm so sorry, Haitians turned to the U.S. for asylum. And Guantanamo Bay was used to detain those Haitian refugees and immigrants. During its peak, they had about 12,000 Haitians detained in Guantanamo Bay. This included children as well as HIV positive Haitians who were medically neglected, Haitian women who were kept at or detained in Guantanamo Bay were forcibly given Depo-Vera and also forcefully sterilized. Among the children, because of mismanagement, many were separated from their families. Because most adults who ended up being taken to Guantanamo Bay were immediately returned to Haiti, no matter the reason. So children would literally be detained in Guantanamo Bay, wake up, and their parents would be gone. And we have issues today with a lot of Haitian children being basically foster children and orphans because of how we treated those children in the Guantanamo Bay. During that time in 94, we start to get what is known as Operation Gatekeeper. That it's a border enforcement program that Clinton approved that doubled the Border Patrol officers. It starts the construction of a 5-mile border wall along the U.S.-Mexican border. It starts in San Diego and basically ends around Arizona. These measures forced migrant routes into more treacherous areas, resulting in increased deaths. From basically up to 2017, there was about 7,000 deaths because of this forceful change of migration routes because of Clinton. During the 90s, we also start to see more for-profit immigration detention centers being built. And finally, in 96, we see the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, also known as IIR-IRA, and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. Together, these are known as the 1996 laws. The set of laws has a great impact on expanding the U.S. immigration detention system by expanding the list of crimes of moral turpitude, including nonviolent drug and other charges for which both legal immigrants and undocumented non-citizens can be subjected to mandatory detention and deportation. These laws can be applied retroactively, and they could impose 3, 10, and lifetime bars on returning to the U.S. after deportation. The year afterwards, we get Operation Global Reach in 97, and it became part of a global approach to migrant interdiction. According to the 2001 U.S. Justice Department fact sheet, Global Reach was a strategy of combating illegal immigration through emphasis on overseas deterrence. The INS established 40 overseas offices with 150 U.S. positions to provide a permanent presence of immigration officers overseas, trained more than 45,000 host country officials and airline personnel in fraudulent document detection, and completed special operations to test various illegal migrant deterrent methods in source and transit countries. But yeah, until then, after that, we see the basically going over to you, Lumpy, we head into the year 2001, where we have something that ultimately sets up everything.
Yep. Finally, we are at the modern day part of all this. For this episode, I'm discussing the history of ICE over the last almost 23 years of its existence. And in part 2, I'm focusing on the ramping up over the past year. So in this one, I will be mentioning some ramping up on the previous administrations. And I just wanted to let you all know why I was not focused on the current as much as I should be at this time. So with that, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE, was created alongside the new Customs Border Patrol, known as the CBP, on March 1st, 2003. This was part of the new Department of Homeland Security that was created in an overreaching response to 9/11. The CBP was created to secure the borders and ports of entry, while ICE was created to work the interior. One of the issues the lawmakers pushed as an invented reality through media before and at the time, and still to this day, was that there wasn't enough enforcement with INS, the agency that ICE and CBP replaced, in the interior, and that was supposedly much needed. One story I saw researching this was from 2003 in Nebraska, where an undocumented Mexican baker opened a shop and his community couldn't get enough of his Tres Leches cake. Oh, the horror, he must go. Right out of the gate, we are being made privy to the decisions to get rid of old policies that protected people's civil rights. Robert Bonner, who was the commissioner of the U.S. Customs Service prior to 9/11 under George W. Bush, was moved to commissioner of the CBP in March 2003. In August of 2003, mere months after the creation of ICE, Bonner revealed that the rules have changed, and those rules that were now to be ignored involved prohibiting racial profiling for the most part. It went like this. The chief in San Diego reminded the agents under his command that there was a long-standing policy which prevented agents from conducting large sweeps or just stopping people on the streets and in their workplaces, which is a little bit BS, but whatever. Bonner jumped in to say, ignore that, and that those policies are now lifted, which raised a lot of red flags for migrant advocates. Basically, though, they were in place, but the agents before this were still doing stuff. But I guess there were some people that, wanted to play by the rules, I guess. But those were all just gone after that. In 2006, during Operation Wagon Train, the largest raid ever conducted at that time, 9% of the Swift meat packaging plant employees, 1,297 people, were rounded up. Most were deported not for crimes, but because they were forced to sign a paper saying they agreed to be deported. This highlighted how families are split up during all this, and people were rightfully upset that they had no contact with their family members, which was finally rectified, but sounds like it was still hard as it is today for them to actually reach the people that are in custody, because as people who were rounded up and finally released said, they were moved around a lot. They also talked about the hard conditions and barely edible food they were served. Moving on to the Obama era, who still holds the record for numbers of formal deportations early on, there was a push in ICE to close detainee records, meaning the detainees were to be held secretly. As Elliot Osment, he's an immigration lawyer from Tennessee who fought for immigration rights most of his life, said, consequently, Secretary Napolitano is about to inaugurate the country's first enforced disappearance program. Attorneys, family members, and the media will no longer be able to verify or locate immigrant detainees. I'll add, this was not the first enforced disappearance program that happened in the US, where they used and still use the prison systems disappearing people for a time when needed, but it was always fine for immigrants to be lost for sure. The current border czar, Thomas Homan, who has taken over heading up Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis now, first worked for Obama. Under Obama, he suggested that family separations would be a great thing to employ because it would deter immigration. It wasn't, and it didn't. All it did was manage to lose 1,500 children in the system. Another thing that was being highlighted during the Obama years was how many U.S. citizens were being picked up, but that is to be expected, I guess, when you are ramping things up to earn your title of deporter in chief. By the way, there was no record kept on how many actual U.S. citizens are picked up by ICE simply because they are not required to report this. In 2009, there was a report of almost 19,000 immigrants sitting in U.S. prisons for years. This is from the Odessa American, dated March 16, 2009. The data showed that 18,690 immigrants had no criminal conviction, not even for illegal entry or low-level crimes like trespassing. More than 400 of those with no criminal record had been incarcerated for at least a year. A dozen had been held for 3 years or more. One man from China had been locked up for more than 5 years. Obama managed to deport 3.1 million people during his time in office. Well, that is formally deport, which doesn't include the numbers of people turned away at the border or people who agree to self-deport. Trump only managed to formally deport less than 1 million and then adds in the numbers from the borders and self-deports to reach 1.5 million in his first term. I'll mention this here and we'll talk more on it in a second, in the second episode, but his demands for this term is 1 million a year. He so desperately wants to beat Obama's numbers. In his first term, Trump's ICE took the shackles off and stopped the pretense that they only went after criminals. This was done in 2017 when Trump signed into law a few executive orders that freed up the agents to go after any undocumented immigrant. It allowed for collateral arrests of family members who had no violations against them as well. Since 2017, spanning both Trump's first and Biden's administrations, many detention centers have been created or reopened for use, and the use of private prisons has risen. Yeah. We saw the tent cities created to house the overflow, especially the ones they kept the children in, which started under Obama. And for all the progressive ones about kids in cages, we heard little, if anything, about those kids suffering the same fate under Biden, even though they were. In 2018, Trump directed DHS to stop the catch and release policy at the border. Catch and release was a program mainly for asylum seekers and families to stay inside the United States while waiting decisions on their status. Trump made these people wait in Mexico, and they were made to try to seek asylum in other countries first before they could even be considered in the United States. Biden's immigration policy is always going to ring in my head with the repeated phrase,
Do not come. Do not come.
As Harris told Guatemalan migrants in 2021. Biden went into office promising to reverse a lot of the policies Trump put in place, but failed to do so and actually doubled down on some. He chose to keep Title 42 in place. This is what I brought up before. Title 42 expulsion is a provision that was added into law in 1944. It was a pandemic-era public health order that allowed authorities to immediately expel migrants to their home countries or Mexico, effectively suspending their legal right to seek asylum. Trump tapped into this during COVID, and Biden kept the policy going for months after declaring COVID was over in September 2022. I just want to mention, the whole, Mexico, the people had to wait in Mexico. We use Mexico, as a waiting room or something. I don't know. There were a significant amount of migrants deported by Biden's administration at the border in the scheme they used to pump the numbers up, according to Jessica Vaughn, the director of policy studies in the Center of Immigration Studies, where CBP, instead of turning the person away, they give them to ICE to process. Every single admin from W on have pumped more money into ICE, with the largest increase last year, more than tripling the budget. And there have been a lot more hires. And as I brought up before, they are hiring from the ranks of the right-wing paramilitary groups. The two agents involved in shooting Alex Preddy have been identified as two veteran agents, 7 to 8 years in and 11 to 12 years in, respectively, working with CBP. And all the Democrats want to do about it is give them more money for training and body cams. There's no fixing this, as our friend Crazy kept bringing up, but there is no fixing this. ICE needs to be abolished. All right, so that was our episode on the history of ICE, immigration, policing, and all that. And next episode, we are going to be talking about the recent events, and we'll see where we go with that. So until we see you later, with that, we say keep fighting the good fight, but do so as safe as possible. Good night.